There we go. Okay. My sound has been doing weird stuff since the Windows update. I see sound coming through here. Hopefully sound is coming through to people. I'm not sure if anybody will really be joining us. I will keep an eye on the chat, but mostly what I am doing is, well, let me really start now that we've got everything fixed. How about that? Welcome, everybody. Yeah, sound. There we go, yeah. I wanted to welcome everybody. I had sort of an idea for a game today, and then I had sort of the pleasure of talking to Tim about it on... we did Tabletop Terrors today, we recorded and stuff, so that video isn't live yet, but we talked about a game that we kind of landed on a working title of Perspectives. I say landed on, I told Tim that's what I wanted to call it, though he had a very good suggestion. The thing is, near the end of that stream, I said something weird, maybe it was in that, and maybe it wasn't, but I think it was, where I said, you know, Tim, I think I wrote this game already. And it occurred to me that a while ago, I was just feeling cool, like good about something, and wrote down some notes. And I am going to go back at those notes and look at them. Yeah. Hey, hello, Grady. Hello, Rekaim. I'm very sorry. I don't know how you would pronounce that name. Elucidate me if possible. I hopefully that was close. But yes, we're hanging out. I am basically going to talk to myself here, engage with the chat if anybody is around, but mostly what I wanted to do was look at something else, something I had written a while ago. I don't really remember a ton of, with a new perspective, basically, where a lot of what I wrote here is basically what I talked to Tim about. Like, I talked to Tim today about this new game I was coming up with that I thought I was coming up with today. And I realized these notes that I wrote a while ago were that game. So I'm going to look at them, and I am going to describe this game to you as though these are not my notes, because it doesn't feel like they are. So let's see how that goes. So at the time, the game was called Flaws. Maybe it's called Flaws. Maybe it's The Collective. I wanted the game to use a trait/lens system. So those are two words that mean something to me. Traits in this context are if you have ways that you act in the world. So a trait you might have might be angry or cowardly, and this would be on your character sheet, and that's just sort of like a thing for you to come back to, where if you don't know how you would react in a situation or you're looking for something, you know that, well, you are cowardly, so that's kind of easy to go to, you know. It almost creates a little bit of an archetype that you play to, that you can build. So, and then the lens system, which is giving the players a very specific perspective, I know now, to look through for the lens. So, like, in this case, like, oh, okay, your character might, struggle with alcoholism. How does it look to you to see somebody else going through that? Sort of along with the description of, like, what's happening in the game, you're giving them a little bit more context of how they should feel. And that's a part of the game. At any point during the game, a player can use your own flaws against you. So at the time, I had this very specific idea of a game where it was going to be very different. Like I said, I have a new perspective, so I'm going to go over these notes. But at the time, the game was a little less like an RPG and a little more like, I don't know, something else. I sort of played with this idea of a roll all at once, resolve dice system, like to make it more like a Fiasco-style game where you roll all these dice and you can resolve these different things, but depending on like what you spend, if you get a 6 or a 1, you'd be able to say this type of thing or that type of thing, right? So mechanics that drive what you can and can't do or say in the game, sort of like the dice are constraining your what you're able to do. I think that idea is very cool. By the end, I believe I drop it, but now that I say that out loud, this is kind of the point of the stream. Now that I say something like that out loud, I realize where the real benefit of that is. So, but moving on. Version 1 of the game. I do this thing in this document for a while where I keep saying, I'm going to get to this, and I don't think there's eventually a payoff. So please know that I'm going to read those parts a few times, and it's going to seem weird, but I don't think there's a payoff for that. But I said, okay, so it would be an RPG mostly based on exploration and storytelling. The game isn't as much about whether or not you pick the lock, but rather what are the social ramifications of picking the lock. Maybe checks are made through a lens of, there's going to be a ton of typos in here too, made through the lens of what's the best way this can go and what's the worst way this can go. So I like the idea of this type of game flow. A player tells the game master, of which there may or may not actually be one. Again, I wasn't convinced what type of game this would be. So the player tells the game master, I want to pick the lock next to me in the Motor Court Motel we're at, right? Okay, some people here. I guess I should stop for that. A few people saying hello. Thank you for checking on the sound, everybody. Andrew says, hey, just checking in. Tabletop Terror's Absolute Basics videos got me started in D&D, and I'm forever grateful. Now, years later, I'm writing notes for my own RPG. You all are an inspiration. That is so amazing to hear, because I'm so happy to do what I'm doing now, and if anything I've ever done has inspired what you're saying, that is an amazing feeling, because I think it's almost important to be doing it with such a passion in order for it to have the maximum impact. So thank you, Andrew, and everybody joining us. So the player tells the game master, feel free to ask any questions in the chat. Any questions. Questions are so super extremely encouraged. And if you need me to explain anything, please let me know. No, and that's, of course, Tim in the chat. I say, of course. I want to let you know. So a player tells the game master, I want to pick the lock next to me in the Motor Court Motel we're at. So I used this word Motor Court because specifically it's one of those seedy type of places, but also it implies, I believe to me and everybody, it's a outward-facing doors kind of thing, where like if you're picking a lock in a motor court, somebody can probably see you, you know? And that's important to this. I do that a lot, where I will make a shortcut to myself so that I don't have to type all of that, but that sort of thing is specific language for a reason. Maybe they even have to specify a lens to take most actions, especially if they're juicy. I use this because I almost got a kick out of knowing that eventually I would be sharing this with somebody. Whatever. I'm so dumb to myself. Especially if they're juicy. This is a word I'd use to imply that they're important to the story or to progress the narrative. The point would be to cover the same case, picking a lock, but decide whether or not it's juicy. Again, a term that I don't plan to be used in the game, based on whether or not it progresses the narrative or is important. That distinction, whether or not it progresses the narrative, because when you say, is this thing important? Is this thing necessary? The reason it's important or necessary is left up to sort of the context of the players. The idea is it needs to be narratively important. Like when we say Chekhov's gun, it doesn't matter what kind of gun it is, right? But when you say Chekhov's gun, you know that it is this narrative concept of like, oh, that needs to come back later or we don't fulfill that thing. That is what this is in order for it to be juicy in this context, those things, it needs to make the story more satisfying, I guess, is another way to put it. The GM then decides, and this is where GM list might be better. At the time, I had this very specific idea of how it would go. So I'm going to go through this and then tell you the different perspective I have now. Someone decides or brainstorms what the implications of the action would be, asking the question, for example, what would someone think of your character, in parentheses, if they saw them picking a lock in a shady motel? So you're not necessarily rolling in this case to pick the lock or not, right? You're succeeding, but at a cost, as some people might say. But the idea is you're succeeding in one area for a cost at another, which creates management, which I like. I like management in games. So you would brainstorm like, okay, well, who is around to see you? And in this brainstorm, there are a lot of implied other things. Like there would be NPCs in the world, and you would, in this case, say, okay, well, Shady Joe would be at the motor court, so he might see me, and he could tell someone, right? This is stuff that is not covered here, but that I know, and the notes are there. The phrase "make a Chekhov check." Oh, I may have said that. I didn't realize that. Amuses me a bit too much, but and then anytime I put something in parentheses like this, I say it implies dynamism. So the sentence would be usually asked with some traits, flaws, or lenses applied. So this was a good example of like what that would look like from the game. You would take elements like from the character sheet. These things would be on there, and we'll get to that. What would someone think of a washed up, this would be on the character sheet, has been, wearing a stained shirt, equipment, picking the lock of a motor court think? What would Shady Joe think of what you're doing, right? And you're rolling to see if he finds out, maybe. So you're picking the lock because you need to get in to get a clue, or you could wait for the owner to be back, but they probably aren't going to be honest with you, for example. You're a detective in this situation. The thing is, you're a washed-up detective with a stained shirt picking a lock at a motor court. Someone is going to pass that information on, and later that's probably going to matter, right? It's going to be narratively juicy. Wow, I'm so mad at myself that I let myself set that precedent. I'm really upset about that I'm going to have to use that word the whole time. So then, and I was writing, so this is the part I'm making up right now. You brainstorm what types of tags would apply to the play sets, or would apply to this. Play sets would probably have sets of tags, just like they'd have specific types of clothes. Okay, this stuff is like not worth explaining, or like expounding upon rather, because it's like, oh, what you'd go, oh, okay, I get it. But okay, so for example, you'd look for something tonally appropriate from the list to say about the scene. I guess this is the cool part. So the idea is you would have, I guess this is really cool. You have sort of a list of words, descriptors, that everybody has, and it's like tone Bible for the world. And so the idea is you have this set, and there's like, they run the gamut, right? But they're all of a specific type. They have something in common, and I say this and I hate to say it, but apple je suis. Stupid inside joke. That's how Tim said, and then maybe his daughter copied how he said apple juice. It was really ridiculous. We built a computer yesterday. The idea is you have this tonally appropriate list of things that are all related to each other in that they are in the same group, right? The idea is if you put anything you put on this list colors the whole list if you're using it as a set, if anybody can pull from this, because eventually they're all going to kind of come up, right? And so that concept, having a tonally appropriate list of things to say about the scene. For example, something that follows so far would be to describe that action as pathetic, right? It'd be pathetic to see somebody picking a lock at what is usually a very cheap place where people say that sometimes don't have a lot of money. That would be the impression somebody would get seeing. It doesn't matter if those things are true. You might be picking the lock because there's a killer in there, and it doesn't matter. Somebody that doesn't know your story that's across the parking lot is looking and going, what a pathetic thing to do. And that's what's important. Pathetic is in that tonally appropriate list of things. So it's going to come up a lot, and it's going to come up in contrast and comparison to all of the rest of the words. I hope any of that makes sense. So Hellmage says, I like that. You could try to do a social stealth system. Like that old bit of wisdom, carry a clipboard and walk fast and no one will question you. Game of looking like you belong. See, I love stuff like that, right? Because if you think about it, yes, that sort of thing is possible. Let's talk about that. So if we set up one of these situations, sorry, I'm scratching my foot. If we set up one of these situations where you go, okay, what would someone think of a person walking with a clipboard quickly through security, right? That is the question we're asking. If you, as a player, what that means is you set up a situation where you go, okay, you need to get backstage. What are you going to do? This is me as the GM asking you, right? What are you going to do to get backstage? And you say, well, what's that old adage? Carry a clipboard and walk fast and no one will question you, right? This is totally in the game. They go, okay, yeah, so you find a clipboard, that's no problem. You know, you buy one at the store, whatever. You've got to get backstage. You get a security vest and a hard hat. Like, you totally look like you fit in. You are walking and acting and playing, all the while rolling skill checks, not to see if you succeed or fail. You don't see if you succeed or fail necessarily when you try to convince somebody that you belong here. But as the GM, I notate what you've done, and that really all I'm saying is rather than whether you've succeeded or failed, it's what does it matter? Does somebody notice? And that creates that because you might not know. You don't know. I want to create a situation, and I feel like this is doing that, where the player feels like they have eyes on them because they're rolling and they know that roll was low, but they don't know what that means. They don't know what it means to have a 5 on that. Like, oh, well, the janitor saw me because I rolled a 5. He definitely knows that I don't belong here for some reason, right? The player is now like, and what I'm going for is the player is now paranoid themselves because they know they didn't do well rather than the normal immediate you failed. So yes, I love that. Thank you. Stuff like that is very much encouraged because I will find myself going way off on a tangent and forgetting absolutely what we were talking about. So we had the tags. We were talking about that. Okay, the thing is we've decided a specific perspective in this case. Now, this is something that changed, so I'll say this and then we'll talk about it. If we describe something as pathetic, in a sense, we are deciding to take a stance on that. As I pointed out earlier, one person's perspective of it being pathetic may not be the other if they realize you're a detective and the brass is tying you up with red tape because the mayor's on the take, so you need to pick this lock to get in here because you can't get a warrant. Nobody knows that, right? But that's the thing. Society or anybody looking at you, as a whole, is that perspective. So by choosing a specific perspective, we can apply a more tone to the world because the goal would be for it to be a lot more real and relatable. And then I said, no reason for that to be in quotes, which I realized at the same exact time I did it. This is an interesting exercise because I have some of that like consistency in thought where that same thing occurred to me right as I was reading it. But what I want to point out here is this is what I wrote, but then when I talked to Tim about the game today, I realized that the goal was to explicitly state and set different players' perspectives, and see how it plays out. Like, not necessarily giving players the ability or like the ability within the game to change their perspective. You can't be convinced, basically. So Grady says, so given or observed impressions, great words for that, with negatives and positives. Yes, like, just what would somebody think? What would a rich person think? What would a poor person think? Like, again, and this is, there are other parts where it's like, there are things that you would check in that example. You'd have sort of a list to go through, and what would this type of person, whatever. But yes, absolutely, I love that. So, but the thing I wanted to say about this is the game became giving the players perspectives and making them look at a situation a specific way through a specific lens, and then some of the fun and enjoyment is them acting that out and sort of playing it out, knowing that they may feel a different way. Tim pointed out that he thought it would help a lot with empathy, and I agree with that. That sort of thing, like, if it's a given that something practiced can be, improved upon, there's no reason that feeling empathy would not fall under that umbrella, right? So anything where we can do that, in my opinion, is not a bad thing, and so I agree. So this is where I said a few times, like, I allude to something and I don't get to it, so be ready for that. After this part, here comes the part I hope is cool. No, depending on which lens is going to stop you or spur you on, another player takes on the role of the rest of your collective. Now, again, at the time, this game was something very different, where I wanted players, and it can still be this, but it's up in the air. But that was what was interesting, is this was a very different thing, and now I've come up with this new idea I had today, and I've put it in here, and we're just mashing them together, and this is fun. So we'll just read through this. So after this part, depending on which lens is going to stop you or spur you on, we'll talk about that in a minute, another player takes on the role of the rest of your collective. You then proceed to have a conversation with yourself as played by other players. This should work because they know from inside the game, and they have access to your character sheet, right? Like, they have the knowledge that they need to be that character because they were here and a part of the game. So even though it's now, they find themselves in a different sort of play position, they should still be able to make it cool, for lack of a better phrase, I guess. This can also mean we make characters for specific tonal things in the game. So a character that has alcohol addiction can manifest. It can have a voice and traits about it. This concept allows people to hot swap what character they're playing and should lead to some cool situations. So this got me really excited, because that idea is that if you're writing things down about specific characters, for example, right? So we have these traits and lenses that we talked about earlier. Traits are things like you might be cowardly, touchstones for you to move to on your character sheet that will potentially have mechanical benefits, but for right now, don't, but I want them to. So you have traits and you have lenses, but for example, you might have a lens, I think, that is alcohol addiction. And so if you're in a situation where you have to go to a bar, somebody in the game might suggest, and this is again where I'm not so sure about how this manifests, but the concept is somebody goes, hey, listen, you have alcohol addiction, or you more likely would have to as a player. Maybe the GM has a list, whatever. The GM would have some idea. That's the whole thing. But I would say, there's a drink here, I am going to have a hard time not taking one. And so we then sort of almost break off and do a little scene using the same players, right? It's not only one person, where now it's me alone with my thoughts. Even though we're in this scene, we pause, right? And it's like a movie. We're like doing a cutaway. And the other players play predetermined or decided characters with specific voices and mannerisms that are those things manifest. So alcohol addiction might slur their speech, or in fact, maybe I'd go the other way and they'd be really well spoken. And they would enunciate a lot. And if you decide to take the role, you go, okay, so you're fighting alcohol addiction. I want to play them this time. It's going to be very adversarial. I'm going to try to convince you to take a drink. And I'm going to play my version that is sort of some makeup of these things that we've all agreed on, that we're all interpreting differently. I am going to play that character in this scene. And it's sort of adversarial, but not, because you're against yourself, and there's probably some checks that will decide who wins, so that it's not a competition or really being... The point is that it's not about really convincing or anything. It's like, there will be cases in the game where you go, okay, try to convince him again. He's not going to bend. He's not going to agree. But say what you just said again in a different way. Like, literally just keep trying to convince him. I want to have rules in the game that support that sort of structure, if that makes sense. There was a lot there, but a few more people said, okay. So Hellmage, this is reminding me a bit of a game Everyone is John, but played straight rather than silly fun. So I don't know Everyone is John, and that's really interesting because I love a good silly fun game. But it would be like more akin to sort of a very story-focused narrative game, but I do think it would generally really benefit from like really themes like that, like pathetic and washed up and different things like that. Oh, Keel, yeah, this is too interesting and I need no distraction. I totally get that. Thanks for joining while you could. Awesome. But the idea, that was the important part, is that if we are playing this game with these different flaws, these sort of inner demons, I guess we can call them. Then multiple people can play the same character, sort of getting to fill the shoes of that character, sort of step out of their own for a minute, and play it while we also get a roleplay moment from that character and resolve through that moment whether or not they do end up, say, taking that drink. So, and then I said, okay, separate thing, maybe how traits and flaws work. I was still working on the specifics of those. So maybe flaws are excuses to do something. Calling them excuses in game is enticing. I like excuses as the name of the concept. And a character's traits are ways characters act in situations. Okay, so this is what I went over. I remembered this part. So, okay, we have examples. A flaw might be that you're covetous and that you can't stand others having more than you. This is probably even too specific, I decided. Maybe instead you struggle with impulse control is how I would abstract that. By making it a little broader, it can be applied to more situations. I think we can find a way in character creation or have pre-gen. So this is more where I'm talking about where if you know you have traits and flaws and vaguely what they should be, and we talked earlier about having a set of all the things that together make a tonally appropriate bucket of things for our world, we can do that with any of these other things, like traits and flaws. If there are only traits and flaws to pick from that make you a pathetic, washed-up detective, you're going to play a game about a pathetic, washed-up detective. Very broad example, but hopefully it makes sense. Hellmage. Everyone is John is a short, silly, fun game where all the players play disparate voices or personalities or spirits, all vying to control one character. They're John. So it's hard not to imagine that's not sort of somewhat related in the same arena, we'll say, as being John Malkovich, a very funny movie I only recently watched for the first time, where that's sort of the idea. I really like that, and that's what's interesting. What I talked to Tim about today, this is the fresher perspective that I came back with to this game, was I realized what I wanted was more scenes in a role-playing game that allowed a player to be alone with their thoughts. There are some things you say to other people, and there are some things you think to yourself, that you would never say out loud. And that's sort of like some of the, deepest, darkest stuff in a way. Tim mentioned he imagined this would be a very potent game, and I think he's right. Where depending on how you did it, it could feel like a really sort of intense movie or something. You'd have to be ready for it. You wouldn't dive in willy-nilly, I guess. So, okay, I think we find a way in character creation or pre-gens where a character with the right set of traits and flaws to have... The idea is you would also balance them some way. And I have some ideas that aren't necessarily important to this, right? Because it's once you get to that part, I think it's time to start trying to balance it. But I have some ideas. But the point would be that you choose like traits and flaws and some better things and some not as good things to create something that is balanced in a way that will create it being sometimes it is this where you get a benefit and sometimes it's this where it's not. And more often than not, it's the worst thing. It's not an equal split. So it's more about, I don't think in any case that I would punish a player for not acting in the way their character would, right? That's another important concept. If you have that idea of, okay, these are your traits, nobody can say you need to act cowardly now because it says it on your sheet. You are the only one that can say, I am deciding to act cowardly now. At some point, you get to be brave. That could be your arc. That could be that could be the thing that makes you more of a coward, because when it was more important, you didn't stand up, and when it meant nothing, you did, right? That's where you get that moment as well. And so I think that's important. So it's more the guideline of how characters, consistency of thought is the best I can say. This is a very fun exercise. It's more about the guideline of how the character can be expected to act. There's probably something called arcs in the game. I got distracted, and then I repeated it. There's probably something called arcs in the game that come up when a player is specifically able to overcome their traits. I'm blowing my own mind because without continuing, I explained this concept and have now tied it together. A player's arc is when it maybe is a subversion or they do something, it is that arc of a specific thing they do, right? So if there's an action they take in the world that we decide is pathetic, something like that could be the thing that everything hinges on. Maybe they're implicated in the murder that they didn't realize had taken place in there. And so that arc sort of comes to a full circle, comes to fruition because we knew that thing happened before, Chekhov's gun, right? You picked a lock and it was pathetic and somebody saw you. The GM knows that. We talked about that earlier. Now that the GM knows that, he or she gets to bring that around and go, oh, that mattered because, right? We talked earlier how the narrative is in this case, in these types of games, what we're leaning on. We're suspending our disbelief, in fact, where sometimes it will make less sense for the thing to happen. And in the game, maybe this is a breakout box, they'll chalk it up to, well, things are stranger than fiction. It just occurred to me that I love the idea that in a game world, a player might say, well, truth is stranger than fiction. I never really thought about that. But okay, so I get more into how the game works here. I didn't consider how long this would take. How long has it been? I don't even know. 31 minutes. Not bad at all. I expected I would be a lot further, but that's okay. There's this many, 16,000 letters, I think. Words. 2,000 words. By setting up the structure of the game to lean heavily on... Oh, okay, so I decided to look at exploring the world. How would you explore and move through the world? Achieve this by setting up touchstones, specific things to interact with in scenes. These will be structured scenes of exploration and exposition through the lens of exploring the world. In some cases, as little as just a description of a painting that's on the wall, up to and including a more structured scene where a character goes through a book they found. Okay. Oh, Mapronomicon. Sorry, I'm really bad about seeing this. In my early days of gaming, the system I horseshoed together had special traits and flaws. Missed those early days. I love things in game that remind you how your character is supposed to act. For me, things like traits and flaws are very much that way, where they give you themes to come back to, and so that's really exciting. So here, what I'm talking about, the exploration, by setting up the structure of the game to lean so heavily on preparing very specific things to be explored, you can craft more thematic scenes and have a good idea of what you should prep. What I just described here, sort of inadvertently, is how video games work, right? So if you think of Baldur's Gate, or an example, or games like that, Icewind Dale, I feel like any of those could be. Planescape Torment, even there was a Numenera one, whatever. Those are becoming more popular. In those games, you have a map, and you can only go certain places. And, there's a big map you move around in that area, right? If you're, in Candlekeep in Baldur's Gate, there's, 5 quests you can get in that place. So you can't leave that area, necessarily, but there's a lot to do there. And that concept I don't see a ton... I don't use a lot in my games, is really probably the way I should always say that. I don't see a lot, which is probably my own fault. I was going to say I didn't see them, and it felt like that wasn't as true as it could be. So, man, I really got off track there. But the idea was you're crafting these specific things for the player to go through. So a lot of times in role-playing games, there's what if the players don't go to the town that I prepared? And this game would have within its systems to not allow that to happen. I find that concept silly, so I'm going to try and write it out of my game, right? So the idea is you would know... So you have Candlekeep is my example I'm going to use from Baldur's Gate 1. And if I'm remembering correctly, I should probably use the beginning town of Icewind Dale. That's what we'll do. I don't remember the name of it. I'm sorry, but it's the fishing town. And there's 5 or 6 quests you can get. And there's a simple one where you go up and there's... well... I'm not going to spoil it. I'm going to go through. Okay. I'm trying to decide how I want to do this. It's interesting to do it on stream. We'll go with Icewind Dale. You start out the game, you make your party. It's it's D&D on the computer, if you don't know. but it's a pretty old game. So you spawn and somebody is immediately talking to you. They kind of tell you what's going on in the area. There's some exposition. That feels like what we know role-playing games to be. You go outside and there's fog of war and you can explore, right? And it's like games. It's isometric view, and you click to move, and you have multiple characters, whatever. You can go talk to people in the world. I want to play a role-playing game where that's what happens. Now, part of the problem with that is the map is so important. You go explore and you see a new place, and that's where you want to go. Where, because everybody's not seeing the same thing at the table, sometimes that can be more difficult. And so I feel like ways to get around that, but the idea is you're moving the characters from one important place to another. They don't walk the distance between. You talk out of character. You still discuss it, but you talk out of character about, like, okay, we're going to do this next scene where this, you know. I suppose it doesn't have to be that strict, but the idea is you very explicitly go to a new place, because the fewer things you only describe so many things when you play a game, and so you should only ever be describing the most important things. So as much as it is interesting to say, oh, well, you walk for a little while and it's kind of boring and then you get to the town, let's just take that part out, right? By doing that, we're able to create these scenes where players can, within it, there's a lot of room to move around. And you think, oh, well, how much room could there be in a 10 by 15 room? Well, let's say, for example, the player finds a book and they open it up and they're flipping through the book, and then you do flashback scenes based on what is in the book, right? There is now so much room to play around in this room if you only think of it that way. But you prepped that because they looked in the book, right? So it's not... Break away from considering it being so location-based in order to do this. Hopefully that makes sense. But the idea is, by distilling the things you need, you can put more weight into them, and they become more important by their very nature. Because every time you said something, it was about one of those 10 things, right? Rather than describing a long time the plotting path because you know that you want to sort of throw a trap at them, and you think it'll be unfair, for example, if they hit it immediately, right? Like, you need to, like, start them off. I don't know. I think you get what I'm saying. Hellmage, I've got to scramble off to a lecture. Happy streaming. Thank you very much for joining us. This is becoming something that I find very interesting. Hopefully you guys find somewhat interesting. But it's a cool exercise, and like I said, any questions are welcome. If you have any questions about anything sticks out to you that's cool, not cool, won't work, will work, whatever. Then I went into character creation stuff. So I was thinking that stats could come from different items of clothing and accessories that you wear. Maybe some specific games or mini games come from different sections. I realized my head was getting hot and I wanted to take those off. Okay. So, stats come from different items of clothing and accessories you wear. Maybe some specific games or mini games come from different sections. So I get a little bit into mechanics and stuff here and that. Like I said, later I think I kind of throw that away. So, for example, if you choose that your character has an alcohol addiction, that might add a subsystem for that character that when you're faced with, the ability to drink or not drink, in that case, you would you would have to make that decision, and based on that, you would go into a separate subsystem that only exists if you chose that, right? And that situation comes up. So it creates a different game a little bit for some people. Another way to put that is it adds something to the game that if nobody chooses that, you don't get to see it. And it, in a way that I'm not really used to seeing, adds more replayability to a role-playing game, because you could play a whole session with one and with the other, and the goal would be to make it feel very different in both of them. So traits are just lenses that your character views the world through. An example of a trait would be just, someone that believes strongly in justice. Another example of a trait would be creepy. So in that case, sort of a good, bad thing. But again, depends on your perspective, I guess. Traits should also confer some sort of bonus. So again, there's not really a way to game the system by making sure all your numbers are the highest. So maybe flaws are even a named thing. Okay, so this, I got distracted. But maybe flaws are a named thing, and they are things in the world that cause you to do things you don't want to. So I like, there's something called a compel in Fate, and if I'm remembering correctly, it's a long time. Actually, that struck me just now. I haven't remembered that for a while. But in Fate, there's a thing called a compel, where when you are playing the game, somebody can point at a trait or like a thing about your character. They call them aspects or maybe your high concept. Something about your character that says a thing. Like, I can't resist a big score, for example. I think I can look at that and go, hey, you can't resist a big score, so wouldn't you feel like you would need to steal that thing? Like, I suggest it as a player to you as a player to improve the narrative. And it would be a lot like a compel. It's that exact same idea. But the idea is you would point to people's flaws instead. There would be things like, hey, wouldn't there be alcohol here? I think you'd be struggling. And then, again, not that it's adversarial, but somebody else might go, well, yeah, okay, but there's probably a TV with the lottery numbers on it. Terrible example. With the horse race on, or no, why isn't it a sports game? A football game on, and you've got a big bet on it, so you're distracted from the interaction we're having, and then we play those scenes like we discussed. Macronomicon. I believe scenes and description between events do actually work, as long as, like you said, there's important exposition pertaining to the game. Yes, that's the important thing is, it's more like this game. Like, it's funny because in a way I get to decide, right? Like, what goes in my game. And so I would write it that way, but I do agree with you. It is important and it can do something specific, but to get to the meat of, like, characters... Basically, this game would focus a lot less on the things you see and more the conversations between these things. So absolutely, I agree there's a place for those. But, okay, so another trait would be slurred speech. So everyone... Oh, okay. This idea was, because we've taken these specific things, these traits, that, again, are like a playset. Imagine there's a bunch of them you can choose from, but you can't choose heroic. That's just not on the list. You don't get to choose anyone. It's constrained. So you kind of... Character creation would be almost a little bit of like a negotiation with yourself of like, well, what can I get away with? I don't know if you've played games like that before where it's a build system. Stellaris has this. Many other games have this, but Stellaris is the one I'm most recently played, where there are you pick bad things that give you the like points that you can spend on good things, right? So you can't have the good without the bad. Some of the bad things are far worse, right? But depending on other choices you've made, whether you have a particularly habitable race, like you proliferate even better, you can afford a slower growth rate because it's offset, right? You make an informed decision about that. That's what I want players to be doing in social situations in this game. And so maybe that's what it is too, is I really want the players to be interacting with people. So as long as that's happening, usually whatever that scene is, I think will be important. And then maybe flaw would be alcohol addiction, as we pointed out. This means in the presence of alcohol, the body comes to the brain. I don't know what this means. I wrote it. I think it's a typo, or like sometimes there's a typo that makes it not clear. Okay, so traits are how the body looks, feels, and acts based on the way you are. There's some level of abstraction between how people look and act to bear the weight of the system. Okay. But flaws are things you have to fight off. So the traits are things about you. You might have a scarred face. You might have crazy hair. And I think it would be crazy hair. And you decide what it is, but yeah. They'd be abstract like that. But flaws are things you have to fight off. So alcohol addiction, that's the one I've used a lot. But let's come up with other examples. Gambling was another one I used. They can be simple things like lying, like pathological lying. It's only because I like the idea of a GM going, hey, that person asked you a question, tell them a lie. You can't help yourself, or maybe there's a resolution, right? But the idea is like almost you're setting up a simulation of the way people would act and giving people agency within it. But by doing so, you get to create situations that players wouldn't do because they wouldn't make the decision to drink if it was bad for them because they can control their impulses. But what if I said, you don't want to drink, but you are not in control of your character's impulses? In the same way, very much the same way that you are not in control of your impulses sometimes in real life. This type of stream requires a lot of water, sorry. I hate the dead air of it, but what are you going to do? Okay, so if you're addicted to alcohol and keep finding yourself in situations when it's around, you're going to have to fight off being an alcoholic. This implies that the monsters you fight in this world are actually your own, and I cringe to use this phrase, inner demons. I later clarify, I'm going to go down to this because this is a fun thing that I like. I like it in my opinion. So, so a dastard. So this is a word that to me is what we call, in this game, the things inside your body. In the game, it refers to any time the player is against themselves or there's a trickster or devil. So to me, a dastard is the thing I call that person in the Twilight Zone that knows what's happening to the subject, right? So if it's death and the person doesn't know, I think there's a salesman one where they have to like they sell death on another day, whatever. I forgot what it was. Like I think every day he asks death for another day, and then like it's a whole life. If not, let's use that as an example. Death knows the torment he's putting this person through, right? He is aware of it, whereas any of the other people in the story aren't, and that's usually kind of the terrible part. An abstract example. Well, okay, let me give a better example and then an abstract example. Another example is like in Supernatural, there were literal tricksters. In that case, broadly, that thing would be a dastard. There's a trickster that like traps them in thought and like makes one of them think the other one is dead, for example. It like torments them for their life or for some portion of it, almost steals their time. Maybe that's a good distinction. But so that's one type where it's like the person that is pretending like to play along to watch you be tormented, but they're actually the one tormenting you. But an example is in one of the first episodes of The Twilight Zone, there's the one where the guy's wandering around like delirious in an empty town and he can't find anybody. He's going crazy and he picks up the phone and spoiler alert, a very old episode of Twilight Zone, it turns out he is in a capsule and they're testing how long somebody can remain in isolation alone, and this guy started going crazy. Even those people that were doing a scientific experiment, because the person forgot and we jumped into the story right when they were after they had gone crazy, right? So we don't know that they're crazy. We're with them thinking, oh my god, this person. And then suddenly our perspective shifts because we realize, oh no, they're crazy. The dastards in that situation are still the NASA scientists, right? It's sort of this broad thing we can apply to anything that torments someone else. So you'll hear me say that a lot, I think, too. So here we go. So this still needs some firming up, but the interplay between them seems to work. The idea that you are constantly struggling with yourself and what people think of you rather than whether or not you're good at things. And in a sense, this just becomes a way to tell a story. It could be easy to look at this and say, well, but what are you doing the whole time? Well, what's the point? Well, you're trying to solve the president's daughter's murder, maybe, or you're trying to, claw your way from the bottom because you used to be somebody, That's the kind of story you would tell. The story is about your journey. And it's not necessarily to make sure you have a bad one, but like, I don't know. I think it would be fun to simulate what it would be like if you were a person that simply couldn't turn down a drink. And it's really weird because I feel like there's a me a long time ago that would have said, that is a ridiculous idea for a game, and I can't imagine anybody would want to play it. And then I played some different games that made me go, oh, but it's fun, or interesting rather, fun and in a novel way to see what that looks like and to really get in a situation where your goal is to explore it as much as possible. And I think it sort of serves for maximum empathy. So I think I had some ideas for some combat system. It starts and ends in a different way. I even said there could be some third thing. This was more when I had a mindset of like Dungeons and Dragons where it was like combat or exploration or, and I think now it's going to be less of an or and more like maybe combat as skill checks. I don't know. So stats come from clothing and physical traits, but what the clothing is affects how it changes your appearance in the world. I really like this idea because the goal is to create a situation where you could create a character that was min-maxed, or actually maximined, with the stats you wanted for a specific situation, but they'd be an absolute mess to play in the game. So I would want to create a system where to get the most stats means you do the worst narratively. You might do really well, like at some actions in the game, but at what cost? The point would be to show how maximum stats is not the point. I suppose it would simply subvert something we're used to seeing. The point would be to make the min-maxing in this game to be building the character you want to try, because how you play and act will change depending on those things. So rather than the numbers being the most efficient, the normal sort of max-min, by causing mechanics that come with them some sort of in-world downside, I wrote that funny, by causing some in-world downside to come with mechanics, you begin to change the utility calculation of someone making a character. It's exactly what I said earlier with the Stellaris thing, where you're picking the bad ones so that you can get the good ones, and you're taking them as a whole to try and see if that's a character you can get away with playing. Imagining clothing, but you could do something similar with armor as well, like if it was a fantasy game or something. I could see there being certain benefits to pairing specific traits with specific clothing, too. So, in the game, you might have the trait creepy, and then you choose an accessory, creepy mustache, right? So now we've decided something about the way your character looks in the game. You no longer get to decide that. The mechanics have. Obviously, you need to be in for that, yada yada. You get it. We're presuming you want to play this game. So, you are now somebody with a creepy mustache, and that has the trait creepy, so you are going to get benefits for acting in a way that is creepy. It incentivizes that. But the game, the point of the game, is sort of the opposite of that, potentially. You are also trying to get to the story, but because it's sort of a perverse incentive type thing. I didn't really think of it that way before, but I think that the goal would be to create interesting situations where, I'll say it with an anecdote. For a long time, for a lot of my life, I made characters look like what I wanted to look like in the game, or look cool. Like if I made somebody in Skyrim, they had to look cool. I couldn't look funny. I couldn't be old. I couldn't be something that at the time I didn't want to be. I just had this idea of a hero in my head. And then one day I made a World of Warcraft character he was balding. I mean, I was pretty young at this point, but he was balding, and he had kind of hair that goes around, and a ponytail. Was an orc, and he was a weird sort of sallow gray color. The graphics weren't great, but I was just imagining all this. And he had this gray beard, and in my mind, it was so the opposite of everything I wanted my World of Warcraft character to be. And it felt so cool to play as them, to at the time, the way I said it, it's a little insensitive now, but I liked playing an ugly character. I think that was a little bit of a narrow view of it, but I liked playing someone outside of what I thought it should be for some reason. And I realize now it's sometimes that just makes for cool situations. So I like the idea that somebody would pick these things knowing the situations I might get them into to see what that feels like, because that's the part of the game. Okay, I like the idea of something called a decision point, where the players specifically have to make a choice. They can talk to the other players about it, whoever will be around, but in the end, it's entirely up to them. So I like this later became stuff that I want to test. Is what I do. I'd mark it hey, play test this, see what happens. Not is it good or whatever, but more what does it do? This is a small case of looking for emergent gameplay, as I'm curious to see what players' instincts will be when they have to make the decision. I wouldn't tell them this, but I'd write it into the game, this idea where, no, you get to decide. You can ask people's opinions, you can argue with them, they may not agree with you, they can convince you if they want, but you have to make the choice. Hey, Bill's here, yo. Please feel free to ask any questions. I am going over game design notes, and sometimes it gets a little bit dense because I just go right off on tangents, but please ask any questions or hopefully enjoy while you're here. Hopefully it's pretty cool. Mostly talking game design and pretty theoretical stuff. Tonal decisions. It's important to say right now, we touched on this a little bit, the game is made in a way that supports a specific style of negative kind of game. To some degree, the game I have in mind from the standpoint of negative traits like addictions and poor decision-making, as we've sort of discussed this whole time. I do think the same system could be used for more upbeat things, and I'm excited to try that and to lean into that tone. But this specific brainstorm, I was in a very specific headspace, so I wanted to lean into that. But I think the game would be made in such a way that you could play different types of stories. It wouldn't have to be this, because again, we have these buckets where we can put our tonally appropriate words and descriptors and things, and if we make that first for the world, it becomes this concept of the world, and then if you only use those touchstones, you'll have the tone you want. You can tune it so perfectly in a way. I think it's important to mention that the game is intended to be a simulation of the collective. So this was an old idea, but the point was that I wanted people to literally confront, like a movie or something, their inner demons, or the angel and demon on their shoulder, like Krunk from Emperor's New Groove, where he talks to them and they do silly things. In this case, it wouldn't be quite as silly, but it could be. The point is, you stop sometimes and you look at a decision and you look at the circumstances that led up to it, and you just talk about how everybody in that situation feels. How is this person just in how they feel? Can't you see the perspective of this person, right? This sort of thing that I think we don't really get very much as humans. I don't know. It seems like a cool idea. Again, it does seem like a potent idea, as Tim said, emotionally, depending on what you play. So, what is the game, right? We've talked this whole time, and we haven't even talked about what the game is yet. None of this so far has touched on the fact that the story will be told while all this happens. I guess we did touch on that a little bit. Playsets would vary greatly in their tone, but the parts of actual players are what would decide the different makeup of the characters. So not only would they be playing this game, but the GM would guide you through the narrative they wanted to convey. In this way, it would be just like RPGs, but I'm also imagining a little bit more of a zoomed-in everyday approach. We did actually talk about this a little bit. A game more suited to detectives solving crimes while also potentially dealing with becoming corrupt or not, right? So the story is somebody was murdered. Somebody was taken hostage. We'll say murdered, right? Immediately I'm like, no, we went too far. Somebody was murdered. You're a detective. Classic story, same old story. You find some evidence that somebody decided you shouldn't find, but they're trying not to show themselves, right? The captain suppresses it. He says, hey, stop looking into that. He gives you some cockamamie reason. Cockamamie would be a totally appropriate word, I think, for this world. He gives you some cockamamie reason, and you start investigating it in your off time, or without telling anybody, right? Because you know something's up. That is the story. While you're doing the investigating, you have to pick the lock of the motor court. That is the game. So that interesting separation there where it's like, no, eventually you're going to find out what happened to that person, but along the way, the whole time, you're going to be explicitly understanding, because we're saying it and exploring it, how every character feels in that situation when they see that thing, when this thing happens to them. Something I imagine will make an appearance somewhere is the concept that I've heard a tip called acting is reacting. And I've never heard somebody explain it, but it seems like a really common acting adage, and in a sense, I get it. You need to be acting like you're in the scene with the other person. Don't necessarily wait for your turn. React to what happened, and as long as everybody keeps doing that, a la real life, like the way we normally do, it's natural. So by separating players from the characters and trying to make their decisions more like something they don't have complete control over, I think you could tell really cool stories where the game becomes who you are and who you become, rather than how good you are at killing goblins or something. And then, see, this is the part I said it's just there's no payoff here. I say, so far, the only part of the game mechanically I've mapped out to use this system is a system like this. When a player is faced with a dilemma, maybe they're called that, they use their characters to fight off the voice in their head. They do so by using powers granted them by their traits. So if a player, in my writing of these notes, this was me recapping, basically, which I think is important, and then I think further elucidate. So if a player wants to do something and their traits say they shouldn't, the voice in their head tries to convince them otherwise. I think, and also vice versa, if they decide not to do something and the trait says they should. I think that's the opposite. The voice in their head is played by another player and has abilities that apply to the main resolution mechanic. Right now I'm imagining a resolution mechanic where you have a pool of dice. And this was the whole thing that I went into, and I actually wrote this as there's content on the Patreon that this became. But later I go, scratch that as part of the notes. So we've talked a lot about these traits and stuff and how other people would think about you. And in this case, we are going to have mechanical opinions of characters in the game based on what people think. So as we talked about way earlier, there were different classes of people, say, there's going to be different groups of people that all have perspectives, as a whole. So there might be, if the game is, depending on what style the game is, it might be classes, like middle class person would think differently of you than a rich person, than a poor person. Just some, it doesn't have to be like social standing, it can be somebody that works at the company you work at and somebody that doesn't, right? It's just a distinction. The thing is, where were we? Okay, so NPCs, have opinions of you, and based on, it would be higher if they worked at the same place as you. It would be lower if they worked at the same place as you and they saw you doing something creepy, right? So you can see how some of these things are going to begin to start playing together, where you can almost calculate how somebody would feel about you and how they would act in a situation. So you record them on, you would, basically your reputation with everyone you meet is based on the things that people know about you. It's also based on your interactions with them. Man, talk about consistency of thought. You wouldn't believe I didn't just read that. You record them on their portion of the character sheet, so you can always reference them. Sup, Tim, driving to work and enjoying listening to game design. That's awesome, Bill, because I am excited to do this, but it's hard not to feel like I'm just saying this to nobody. It is extremely fun for me, but I almost feel selfish to do this. I don't know. It's a weird feeling. I'm not used to this. So it means a lot that you would say that. Thank you. So not only should this make the world feel more alive, but also allow multiple people to play different characters. So I talked about that a little bit earlier, but the idea was that by charting out roughly what characters were like made up of, what you know about them in the story, think about side characters in cartoons like Bob's Burgers, where they're there to play a role specifically. So you're like, okay, they get in, you kind of know something about them by looking at them. They must be from the yacht club. And then in that show, actually, they always say immediately the last thing that the time they interacted, right? This was another episode. This is not an episodic sort of following thing. What happens is somebody goes, oh, the last time we met was when you beat me in that go-kart race. Like, just, they're in with it. That's what that person is. You know so much about them now because you've seen how they look, and that's what this is. You would write those things down. The last thing you did was you beat them in a go-kart race. They have, a members-only jacket, and they're wearing denim jeans. You just go over those details real quick when you reintroduce the person, and hashtag everything is content. Yes, Bill. Literally that. But also allow multiple, and that concept would allow multiple people to very quickly be able to hot swap between different roles and players, and everybody can start to play different people, basically. But what I wanted to do, oh man, I should have did it at the time, but I wanted to go into something. Well, it's not. Okay, so the game would be a series of decisions players could make. That was more brainstorms. Okay. All right, so, and then these were generic brainstorm stuff. I talked about the dice pool, ratio of successes or failures. That, like I said, became a Patreon chunk. Emergent gameplay for roll tables to make different traits. The Mapronomicon. Yeah, this is great to listen to. I had no idea after all this time that you and I were kindred spirits from a mile a minute and on to the next month. Exactly. Like, I have learned that if I want to know if people are interested, I have to show them first, right? I have to do it. So I was really jazzed up. We had some cool hangouts today. A few people were there earlier, and some people said some nice things. I had some fun designing games. Cassie's actually out of town, which meant I kind of had the night free. I might play some video games later, but yeah, I love talking about stuff like this, and it helps me work through it. And like I said, it's such a fun exercise to look back on what I was working on with fresh eyes, as though it was an artifact, like something else somebody came up with. It's really cool. And then generic brainstorm, you aren't able to say where you want to go, but you have to say what you want to do. Okay, I think it's time to go talk to so-and-so. And then I would tell you, you'd find her at the Scallywag Skirt. Who else is in the scene? I like that idea too, where the point was rather than players can only decide to do certain things, like more vaguely, and I think that can solve some of the oddity of like, oh, so do you guys go there? And there's more nuance to that, I guess, but I like the idea that a player says what they want to do almost in a call and response thing where it automatically follows that the next thing I say is how they proceed, basically, I guess. I'm really trying hard to remember what it was I wanted to say because it was about opinions. Reputation with everyone you meet is based on the people who know about you. It's also based on your past interactions with them. But also, oh man. Oh, I did say, and this actually somebody mentioned earlier. In this way, stealth wouldn't always be about not being seen because you're doing something illegal, but because you're doing something questionable. That was really cool. That wasn't what I was trying to think of, but man, yeah, I got thrown way off track. Okay, well, that's all right. This was really cool. It was really fun to go back to, and especially with the new, like I said, perspective on, because of the game we're sort of designing called Perspectives. I'm seeing this more now as these were cool concepts. At the time, I was feeling very much like I wanted to separate from what people understood as RPGs to kind of see what it was like, just notes-wise. And now I'm realizing what things I want to keep. By throwing it all out, I got to take only some of the things I wanted. So these ideas I had then are old now. Like, it's I don't know, an old way of thinking. I have such a new perspective. It's also very interesting to talk about perspectives while talking about a game called Perspectives. Yeah, I'm actually sad I ran out. I feel like we were just getting going. That's not important. Thank you everyone for joining. I always have to remember which order to press the buttons in. But hopefully this was cool. If you watched this after the fact, please drop any comments on the YouTube. On the YouTube. I know it's funny. In YouTube, rather than, we were mostly following the chat here. But if you have questions or anything, I will try and respond to them. Or Let me know if you liked this. That's the important thing. Let me know what you did like, what you didn't like. Did I talk too fast? Did I not talk fast enough? Varying opinions on there. Suppose it depends on your perspective. Thank you guys for hanging out. I wish that I had more to do because I am just like really excited. I'm going to actually play some video games with Barker. That's going to be fun. But thank you guys for joining me, and I'll do this more often. It means a lot for you to say the kind things that you did. So I'm going to try to press the buttons in the right order this time. I forgot our tagline. Tabletop Terrors, baby, 2021.